Okay, welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast brought to you by AMPLOS. If you are joining us for the first time, very happy to have you. Dr. Drew Brannon, joined by Dr. Cory Shaffer. And Cory, we are performance psychologists, which means what?
Which means we are interested in and are all about helping people pursue higher, more consistent level of performance.
Well said. Well said. And
I would the phrase I always use is what we do is we teach the mindset and the skill set of high performance.
Yeah, well said again, times two. Right, and we get to do that in different contexts across different industries, but I agree with you. The common denominator there is helping people optimize their performance with greater consistency. And if you've tuned in before, you kind of already knew that, but we are grateful that each time we know some people are tuning in who haven't tuned in before. So that's a little bit of background on us. And AMPLOS is the Latin word for grow, which also fits and I think is aligned to what you're describing there of growth and development and change. And that's actually at least somewhat on par with what we're talking about today. And so, Cory, I'm going to kind of set it up by painting a scenario. So here's the scenario. And that is if we take a person who is standing in this gap or existing in a gap between these two places of, if for the sake of the image here, on the left would be the option of haven't done it yet. So the thing, whatever the thing is we're talking about, I haven't done it yet. And on the right would be I've done it. So very, very simple, clear kind of dichotomy here of in the gap of haven't done it versus I've done it, and we're just in that gap. You ever had one of those?
Yeah, I feel like the beauty of a topic like this is that everybody can probably come to some scenarios, whether it's your personal life or receiving feedback, something from a professional standpoint, trying to change behaviors, change habits. I mean, any of that kind of fits with what we're talking about here. It's ultimately just the space that exists between inaction and action.
Right.
And trying to understand why do we get caught in that. I mean, sometimes it's like immediate, right? Like I get some feedback and like there is an immediate drive towards, okay, I'm going to change this right now.
Yep.
Unfortunately, I think we can find ourselves in this space for not just days, weeks, months, but probably, if people are honest, maybe years, where, hey, I know I need to change, but I haven't actually done anything to do it, just as one example.
Yeah, exactly. And another way to put it would be, we've talked about this in previous podcasts of kind of the process of growth or the growth process, whatever term you want to use, of that progression or that sequence of awareness followed by action, followed by accountability. And this would be one example of kind of in that gap of awareness and action, although they might not even have the awareness yet. So that's a possibility too. So you may or may not have that. But if you do, we're talking about the space that exists between awareness and action. Maybe you've become fully aware and you know what you want to do, what you want to work on. As you said, Cory, it could be a decision, it could be a behavior, it could be a habit, but you aren't doing it yet. And you're just in that gap. And so today's conversation really centers on, why does that happen to us? What are some of the common reasons why that happens? And then, as we're talking about some of these common reasons, I know naturally we'll also get into what a person can do about that. Because I agree with you, like everybody has been here. And you might have a couple of these in your life currently. You might not, and that's fine. But at minimum, you've had one of these, which I think, as you said, applies to really everybody.
Sure. Or bare minimum, you've seen somebody in this space. Maybe it's easier to recognize this almost third person, where a friend, a colleague, a family member, you know that they're aware of something, you know that there's some action to take, and they find themselves in that space in between. So this could even help you, or if you're a leader, this could even help potentially facilitate conversations that can lead to that type of action.
Yep, that's true. Okay, so before we jump into the reasons, there is one more thing I want to point out here. and this is just an observation. I can't like point to a study or anything along these lines. However, one thing that I know human beings are really good at is it's looking at people or maybe calling people out who are in these gaps and criticizing them. So like we are way better at calling someone else out for doing this than we are at practicing self-awareness around our own example of this and doing something about it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And that's why I noted there, just like, this is probably easier, if we're honest, to look at from the third person perspective. It's so easy to see it in others. And like you said, call it out and maybe even call them out for why they're not taking action or whatever it is. Probably harder to recognize when you yourself are in it. That doesn't mean that you can't. I think there are plenty of people who would acknowledge like, yep, I'm right smack dab in the middle of this space. And I maybe even have some understanding as to why I'm not taking an action, but some of that might fit with some of the reasons that we'll go through here today.
And we don't pretend like this is easy. So we generally don't dedicate podcast episodes to things that are easy because it's less likely that people need help with that or want to think about that or engage that. This is not easy. And the reason this topic generalizes to so many people is because it is difficult and because it is challenging to actually get to the change part or the decision part or the behavior part. We realize that. So, okay. So that said, Cory, let's get into some of the common reasons that people can stay, for lack of a better term, kind of stuck in this space. Hit us with the first one.
Yeah, I think one that we'll start with, again, everybody can resonate with it. If we take a look in the mirror, you can probably see some of yourself in this and previous times when you've been in this gap, but it's just defensiveness. So let's just say, given a scenario, this is maybe more specific to, I've gotten some feedback. Maybe some of that is critical, that I can be, should be, need to be, however you want to phrase it, doing things differently or change in some capacity. But I'm just defensive around it. There's a stubbornness perhaps, or a lack of awareness that's preventing me from seeing things in such a way that others are. And so we just want to push back, challenge, like fight against whatever this feedback is, whatever the change or suggested or requested change might be.
Yeah. Which in that example you're painting, defensiveness is pretty low-hanging fruit. Like it's pretty easy. Mm. And I think that's one reason why people start there and in this example sometimes finish there. But it's not difficult when presented with feedback that maybe I don't like very much to dig in, to push back, to deflect, to disagree with, for a number of reasons. I mean, one of which is the longer I stay engaged in the disagreement phase, the longer I'm able to then avoid any expectation to kind of do it. Mm-hmm. It would be rare for a person to be kind of like working through the murkiness of the feedback and already begin making the change. Yeah. So it buys us time.
Yep. And again, some of this may be a true just lack of awareness. If this is the first time I'm hearing something like this, especially, I think initially the ego part of our brain kind of kicks in and immediately just wants to push back on, well, that's wrong, or they don't know what they're talking about, or just a resistance to really open yourself up to what you're hearing. That's probably a piece of this, is just, the ego, the arrogance almost of, well, they're wrong almost immediately, regardless of what it is. That's such a simple reaction, such a simple response. It's like very, very primal.
Yep. Because, and it's like, think about how thin that is.
Yeah.
It's like, you're wrong.
Yeah, there's not much there.
Go on. Like you would, if you're on the receiving end of that, when you've given someone feedback, I think my first response is going to be like, okay, I'm listening. I'm here to hear more, hopefully. But it's a really easy response. I think it's a common knee-jerk response. And I think whether it's conscious or unconscious, people can have some form of awareness around the fact that, okay, if I'm presented with some feedback that I don't like a whole lot, the work associated with trying to change it could be really painful, meaning time consuming, laborious. It might require me to go, let's just create an example here. Well, maybe the feedback was, hey, you can be really harsh. You've been harsh to me. You've been harsh to people on our team. It's not working for us. This needs to change. Well, part of kind of the process of working through that might be you need to go have some conversations and apologize. And when you have a conversation like that, it's the equivalent, or it can be the equivalent of like scraping your hand along the bottom of the ocean, and you get all this residual dust and dirt, and you kind of bring it back up into the surface. And so what does the water get? Really cloudy, and it's difficult to see. And so, maybe we're painting a little bit of a complex picture to this, but that's a very real possibility that it's going to be hard.
I think sometimes too, in situations like this, the feedback is given, and this may rise to defensiveness or some of these other things we're going to talk about. It may be its own separate category. Is, hey, you're harsh. You're too critical of others, your teammates, whatever. Period.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
You're expected to just go, I don't know, figure it out.
That's a good point.
Okay, now I'm just supposed to change that then,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not telling me how I should do that, where to begin, like what does that process even look like? And I think that, again, maybe that is its own separate category, but that could also be leading to some of the defensiveness, is because it almost is like, well, how much ground do you have to stand on if you can't even tell me how to do it or what it looks like or whatever? You're just saying, hey, change. So boom, defensiveness, pushback.
Or at least some concrete examples.
Sure.
I think that's because they may or may not know how to encourage you to make changes to your harshness. Always fine to give some suggestions, but at minimum, there needs to be like, okay, well, can you give me a little bit more of how this is evidenced itself, or when, or so concrete examples are really, really important. But as we kind of go through this one example, you can see how this just can create this almost indefinite holding pattern of back to our original scenario that we really got into of what's a common reason why a person is standing in this gap and they're not doing anything differently. It's because they're playing this defensiveness game. Mm-hmm. And now we've created this tension in the relationship. And so I don't really want to interact with you a whole lot, and you don't really want to interact with me a whole lot. And it's amazing how long that can go. And then you kind of extrapolate that out. Many organizations these days, the way they function with kind of this hybrid work environment, or maybe you're mostly remote, and you can avoid a lot of people for a really long time. I mean, it's not like you're showing up to the office every day for a lot of the big organizations these days, and your cubicles are right next to each other. You're talking about like your base might be in, here's one for you, Cory, Rochester, New York, Finger Lakes District, mm-hmm. correct? And the person you've got some beef with could be in El Paso.
I would love to learn more about why you chose those locations, but that's a separate podcast. But yeah, I understand. I mean, you just end up in this, ultimately just this stalemate of inaction, inactivity, because I mean, it's just, you end up with two people kind of pointing the finger at each other, almost like, hey, you're defensive, and just, hey, you're wrong. And that's
you're critical.
It just stays there.
Right. You're critical. You're defensive. And it's like, oh, okay. No one's changing. All right. So, let's go to this next one here, and I'll put this one out there and kind of offer it up, and we can get into it. And this is one that can be its own and kind of stand on its own, or I think it can also be a result of some defensiveness. And so I recognize that there's a little bit of maybe a relationship that goes here, and that is making excuses. So excusing the behavior, excusing the delay, depending on what we're talking about, whether it's a decision or a habit or a change of some type. There is no perfect moment to change. There will always be something you can point to, and let's be clear about this as well. It might be really valid. It might be a completely legitimate, fair, obvious factor that you're bringing up to excuse your lack of movement. And that's where we got to get down to where the rubber meets the road here. Whether it's legitimate or not doesn't get you off the hook for needing to do something different and change. That's just the bottom line of it. And if you're not willing to acknowledge that, it is a major, major factor and could be a reason for staying the same.
Yeah, I'll give an example of this one. So this is a personal example, but a few years back, it may have been the Christmas that our son was born. One of the things that my wife and I decided to do for my parents was to purchase them an iPad. So my parents,
I like this one.
My parents are not, let's say, very technologically advanced or literate. But this felt like some really low-hanging fruit. And the idea behind this was really simple. Again, this is either the Christmas before or after our son was born. But it was very clear from our standpoint of like, hey, you live in Pennsylvania. We live in South Carolina. You're probably only going to get to see your grandson, now grandchildren, once, twice a year. This is the simplest way for us to like stay connected.
Right.
And so this opens up now. My wife and I both, have Apple products, iPhones. So getting them an iPad meant, and they don't have an iPhone. I would have to fact check this, but my dad may still have a flip phone, if that gives you an idea of kind of where he's at.
We are with you.
But the point was just very simple and just like, hey, this now gives us the opportunity to like FaceTime you guys anytime. And in real time, you don't just, see pictures, right? But you can see your grandchildren in the moment. And we'll also add you to family photo albums. So you can also see hundreds of pictures.
Even easier.
At the tap of a button, right?
Well done.
And so we did this, and I don't know, 6 months or so go by, and it's like, there's no movement whatsoever from them on this iPad. Like I sat and I set it up with them, which was a painful hour process. And then would try to FaceTime them occasionally, like no answer. Right. So finally just called it out. Like, hey, why are you guys not using this? Right. Like, have you tried to figure it out and this and that? And the specific excuses were just, we can't figure it out. We don't know how to do it. Like, any number of different things to just avoid. And so I had to walk them through like, hey, there's a tips app on the iPad, right? Like just get in there. And I don't care if you spend literally just go through one tip a day.
Yeah.
Right. And just kind of click through it. And I just told them like, you have to just get comfortable with it. You're never going to figure it out unless you just start the process of like every day I'm going to turn it on and I'm just going to kind of swipe through some things. I'm going to click on stuff. I'm going to see how it works. But their excuse is like, well, the example they would always give, again, this is my old school parents, just like, well, every time we do this, we think we're going to send missiles off to a country or something. Like we're somehow going to mess something up. And I'm like, man, that is not how this works. Right? Like good. You're not going to hurt anything. It's going to be fine. You just have to do it. But there were so many excuses, and all of them sort of were rooted in just this fixed mindset of, we're an older generation. We're not comfortable with technology. Mm-hmm. We never will be, period. Like that's what it all came back to. And it took a long, long time to break them of that. And they're absolutely still that way about many things, but they've gotten very comfortable with the iPad to the point recently even, I mean, my mom was like, this is the best gift we've ever gotten.
There you go.
Because of how the access it gives to the grandchildren and all this kind of stuff. So, but at the time, it was just nothing but excuses. And again, in my opinion, just rooted in such a fixed mindset.
Almost kind of this underlying belief or thought that, well, that's a cool thing for like you young people.
Correct.
But our generation, we don't really use tools like that.
Yep.
Are they tech savvy enough to hear this podcast?
Probably not, which is why I'm comfortable
I figured.
talk about it.
Oh, that's why it's an example. Yeah. No, and I can think of, I'll offer one as well. And I think this of my own that I got a feeling others can relate to as well. When we're talking about making a decision, and let's say this is not a decision of like, what are we going with, gang? Is it going to be pepperoni or is it going to be Italian sausage for our pizza? This is a decision of some type of significance. And what I can be guilty of is wanting all the information, as much information as possible. And my wife will be like, if the decision hadn't been made yet, she will commonly say, hey, we need to decide this. And I'll say something like, well, I'm just waiting on whoever to call me back. And then she'll be like, no, you're not. Like there's nothing that's going to come from that phone call that's going to change what we already know about this decision and the fact that it needs to be made. Like you might be waiting on that, but that isn't the reason you haven't made this decision yet. And that can be a common example as well, as like making an excuse. Like I'm creating, and maybe I really am waiting on this person to call me back, but it isn't the thing holding me up from deciding. And we're really good at almost like sending out this, like creating a smoke screen of sorts or some type of thing that excuses and buys us time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think need more information. It's not the right time.
Yeah.
Like those are always going to be really, really common ones that I think probably a lot of people can, relate with. And like you said, just sort of a smokescreen to get off the hook of almost accountability or just ownership over whatever the decision might be.
Yep. And maybe we just pause there for 1 second. And if you're listening to this podcast today, kind of crawl up in your own mind for a second and think about some of the things that are like pending in your life currently. And it could be a decision. It could be a habit that you've been meaning to change. It could be a new behavior that you've been meaning to adopt. There's so many examples of this. And do a little healthy self-reflection and tell yourself the truth. Are you making excuses? Have you contrived this reason or list of reasons or things that you're allowing or you're giving permission to hold you up? And we said this earlier, it's really, really normal for a person to do that with well-intentioned, valid, legitimate lists. So we're leaving room for that. However, it might be essential and important that right now you create some movement, right? Like make a decision, start the behavior, stop letting this thing that you've allowed to put the brakes on it to continue to put the brakes on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the decisions around, let's say, or inaction around changing habit, changing behavior, it's hard,
Yep.
Hey, doctor told me I need to go on a diet or I need to start exercising. Well, I haven't exercised in years. It's hard. I've got a bad knee, this or that. It's like, well, those are all the more reasons why you should.
It's cold.
For one.
Like I'm going to wait till weather warms up.
Yeah, there you go. Right. So now we start almost like bartering with ourselves. And again, those excuses kick in and,
yep.
Yeah. So again, I think everybody's probably been there, but I think just having enough awareness, looking yourself in the mirror, recognizing the excuses is really important.
And the last thing I'll say is this, and this is not a criticism. This is like has really happened where I have seen examples of this with people. You use the exercise one who have literally gone from it's cold. I'm going to wait till it warms up.
It's hot.
It's hot. It's hot. I'm going to wait till the fall gets here. And it just, starts to kind of cool off a little bit and loop.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So let's not let that be us. All right, Cory, hit us with this third one.
Yeah. So the last one is, let's say, just like half truths. So what we mean by that is a person's just their own inner dialogue. Again, you mentioned the idea of like crawling up in your mind. And if we take a look at your self-talk, just the range that can go from right? So sometimes being just completely dead on accurate and realistic, other times just completely out of left field and seem just so far from the truth. The problem is we tend to create these narratives for ourselves that tend to fit, I don't know, what we want,
Yep.
or they're sort of convenient
Yep.
for us. And I think if you think about the intersection of that and how it's probably a very convenient space then to live in this gap that we're describing of kind of inaction, it's similar to a degree, like maybe the defensiveness, but definitely the excuses. But we're just justifying in our mind again, like the reason why we don't need to change.
Yep. So I'm going to call that the cafeteria plan.
I would love to hear.
Ready for this
more
one?
on that?
Okay. Here's where I'm headed with this. We know that the data on self-talk is really compelling, to the tune of, you can look at different studies, but kind of the normal parameters would say we are going, as human beings, going to process between 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day. And if that strikes you as a big number, consider yourself normal. Like, that is a big number. Those are a lot of thoughts. Our minds are extremely active and really never shut off. So we're processing all these thoughts over and over and over again. Here's where the cafeteria comes in.
Okay.
You know how you go in, I hadn't been to one in quite a while, for the record, but you go in a cafeteria and you get your tray and you sit it down and you start working your way down the line. And what's really cool about a cafeteria is, well, you tell me, what's so great about a cafeteria?
I think what you're getting at is, let's just say buffet style, where
Yeah,
you get to select
options.
You get to select what you want
Bingo.
to select.
And so here I'm headed down the line, and the things that I don't like, that don't appeal to me, that don't agree with me, that I'd rather stay away from, I just leave on the other side of the counter. I leave them behind the glass. Versus the things that are appealing, that I am interested in, that I want to, hey, I'm going to choose this. All I have to do is pick it up and put it on my tray. And I just head on down the line, and I kind of create my own universe. I create my own utopian type meal setup for the day or the moment, whatever it is. And then I go about my business. And if we aren't careful, we operate in a very similar way when it comes to our self-talk. All these thoughts are there. Like, you walk in the cafeteria, you entertain your own thinking. And if I approach them with a similar mentality, I'm going to go with the ones that appeal to me and just push back from the others with sometimes very little recognition about what's real versus what isn't.
Yeah, there's a specific cognitive bias that this reminds me of, and it's called naive realism. Basically, it's an egocentric belief that the way that we see reality is as it really is.
Yeah, that's
right.
Scary.
And so, but again, to your point, then, like, how selective we can be with our thoughts and the storyline that we want to piece together for ourselves.
Yep.
We really believe, like, then that's the truth.
Yep.
Right. And again, it's called naive realism for a reason. Is because we're probably not seeing the whole truth.
Yep. And so, okay, let's connect this. How does that account for or trigger passivity, inactivity? Is we're creating our own storyline. We're believing the things about ourselves that we want to believe about ourselves. We are creating this kind of charmed, maybe egocentric, probably idealized notion of us. And in that universe, under those circumstances, there might be very little reason to change. Mm. Like, where's the motive in that? If I have kind of curated this idealistic, irrational life, it might be void of needs to do anything differently.
Yeah, as I'm scanning back through notes here, it's interesting. Our initial reasons, and we noted from the beginning that, like, defensiveness is probably the most surface level, impulsive, reason to not change. You take that, let's say, a little bit of a step further with excuses.
Yeah.
And now I'm justifying my reasons for inaction in some just very shallow type of way. And now half truths are almost like I'm justifying through my own thoughts and the storyline that I've created for myself the reason that I don't even need to change.
Yeah, I've created my own universe.
Yeah, it's like the depth, right? Like we're getting deeper and deeper as we go here. So it's just interesting. I made that observation.
Yeah, I think with this, you're exactly right. And at this level of the iceberg, so to speak, what I've effectively done is made everyone and everything else irrelevant. Because in my economy, under my universe, your feedback has no bearing, has no relevance. There's no ground for that person to really stand on. And so then I don't have to even engage the feedback.
Well, again, a lot of it's going to depend on the story that's being told, and again, just how selective we can be in these circumstances. If it's coming from a different person, maybe somebody extremely meaningful or a really important person in my life or whatever, maybe there's a completely different response to it. But in certain circumstances, if I've deemed for whatever reason, this person, for example, to be the reason why I don't need to take it serious, that's the story I'm telling myself, then I'm not going to change.
Right. Okay, so let's kind of pivot this as we kind of get into this last phase of our conversation here, Cory, and I want to do it in this way. These don't end well. So my point is, if and when a person is in this gap, and maybe you're throwing up the wall of defensiveness, maybe it's more excuses, maybe it's more half-truths, most commonly this plays itself out over time and does not end well for anybody involved. So why should you be motivated to sort this out? Because this doesn't end well if you continue to do this.
Well, but I think that's part of the trick behind it, though, is because there are plenty of times where, not changing doesn't result in anything. Like you can kind of get away with it in some circumstances. I mentioned it from the start. Every month that goes off the calendar where I don't exercise and I'm still alive, like I'm just sort of laughing at the doctor of like, I guess you were wrong. For a while, I agree. But that's the point is like, we're not talking about things that go on for 10 years. Generally, it's, feedback needs, or the feedback, there's an expectation that a change is going to be made or a decision needs to be made shorter term, right? Then like we just don't have the shelf life on these things necessarily. And so, 6 months go by and I haven't really done anything, but there aren't any repercussions to it, then I don't need to change. Right.
That's the illusion.
And the illusion. Exactly. That's my point is I think sometimes we continue to do these things because there is the illusion that like, man, the vast majority of the time it just gets swept under the rug and like I can keep doing my thing and not have to change.
Yep.
Unfortunately, there are plenty of times when it does result in something negative, to your point.
Right. And so I think therein lies the tension and the rub and the motive to change is if you are going to delay until life has its way of bringing this to your attention, that's often a really painful outcome for not just you, but other people that are involved. And so that to me, what is the key thing to help create some inertia, some movement is like, let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge that there could easily be a whole lot of regret one day for the person who decides to continue to be like, I'm good. So we don't want to be there. We don't want you to be there and you don't want to be there either. So let's talk about just some like, okay, where to go from here. And I think for me, it's got to come back to you deep diving on you. And like these things that you're in the gap on, who else is involved? And have you asked for honest feedback? And what has your response been? And have you asked them what your response has been? And like write down, it's amazing how writing things down can really make a difference. Write down what you're calling your reasons are for why you aren't making this change, for why you aren't making this decision. Read your list, share the list with someone else, ask them for their honest opinion. There's a lot we can do here, I think, to prompt some movement.
Very well said. I was just going to come back to this. This is just highlighting the need for consistent quality self-reflection, first and foremost. The need for receiving consistent feedback from people around you and hopefully people that you trust. And on top of that, I think a good exercise, and you mentioned this, but is writing out the reasons for, let's say, not changing, not taking action, whatever it is, and then just having enough willingness and like emotional maturity to challenge your assumptions,
Yeah.
whatever the reasons are, to kind of check yourself.
Right. Yep. And just get some early traction. Like the goal, your immediate goal should not be for you to get you out of the gap and like onto the platform of I've done this and put this behind me. That is not the goal. The goal should be to take a step between or from the gap you're in to in the direction of where you're headed. Like just do that. It's amazing how that one thing can really create some momentum and start carrying us forward. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up for today, just in closing, these are, as Cory said at the outset of our conversation, common scenarios. We've all been there. We're all probably in some example of this currently. As we close, we just want to really issue that challenge of do the work we just outlined, have a willingness to go for it. If nothing else, to help you avoid that painful regret that we touched on, that I know nobody wants to experience. Okay, with that said, as always, appreciate you tuning in. If you enjoyed today's conversation, head on over to iTunes or Spotify. We really would love some feedback from you. Let us know how we're doing and how we can serve you better going forward. Thank you.